Hello everyone, welcome back. Previously, we have derived the demand curve for the consumer. That's the relation between quantity demanded and market price. But how is the market price determined? We know that the market is a place where buyers and sellers trade. Therefore, to discuss the price determination, we need to consider both sides in the market. Given the market demand function and the market supply function, we draw the two curves in one graph. The horizontal axis represents the quantity demanded or supplied, and the vertical axis represents the price. The demand curve is downward sloped according to the law of demand, but the supply curve is upward sloped because as the price increases, the firms would like to provide more product. Then the two curves have an intersection. And the intersection, the quantity demanded equals to the quantity supplied and the same price level. That's to say, all the sellers want to sell and P star can sell out the commodities, and all the buyers want to buy and P star can get the commodities. None of them have incentive to change the price. So we define a market is in equilibrium when total quantity demanded by buyers equals total quantity supplied by sellers. If the market price is higher than quantity price, such as P1, and that price, the quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded, then some suppliers cannot sell out all the product. They are willing to reduce the price to attract more consumers. As the market price decreases, the quantity supplied decreases, and the quantity demanded increases until they are equal with each other. In the same way, if the market price P2 less than the equilibrium price, the quantity supplied is less than the quantity demanded, there is a shortage in the market. That means some buyers cannot get the product they want to buy. They would like to pay more for the commodity, then the market price is gradually pushed up until the supply quantity equals to the demand quantity. Given a supply curve and a demand curve, we can find a market equilibrium. But we know a demand curve as well as a supply curve is determined by many factors, such as consumers' income, the prices of other commodities, consumers' preference, and the prices of input, and so on. If those factors change, the market equilibrium also changes. So we use comparative static analysis to examine how equilibrium follows the change in demand or supply. And now we try to use this method to discuss how the tax policy influences market equilibrium. We consider a quantity tax, which is levied at the quantity level of commodities. A quantity tax levied at a rate of T is a tax of T levied on each unit traded. Quantity tax can be collected from the seller and can also be collected from the buyer. How does the tax affect market equilibrium? Does the effect of taxing the buyer differ from that of taxing the seller? Who pays the tax? How does tax affect the social welfare? Those are the questions need to be answered. Before tax, the price buyers pay is the price sellers receive, and the market equilibrium can be determined by this equation. The quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. If the government imposes a quantity tax on each unit of commodity X, the buyers must pay more than the sellers receive. Consider the tax rate is $T. We use PD represent the price paid by buyers and PS represents the price received by sellers. If the tax is levied on buyers and the sellers sell at PS per unit on the market, then the buyers should pay PS to the sellers and T to the government. So the buyers actually pay PS plus T per unit. If the tax is levied on sellers, when the buyers pay PD for each product, the government will charge T as a tax. Then the sellers can only receive PD minus T. Therefore, regardless of whom the tax is levied on, PD is always greater than PS by T. The tax changes the price paid by buyers and received by sellers, so they will respond to the price change. The quantity demanded is a function with respect to the demand price, PD, while the quantity supplied is a function with respect to the supply price, PS. Only when the quantity demanded equals to the quantity supplied, the market goes back to equilibrium. Therefore, these two equations are the conditions for the new market equilibrium after taxation. Notice that these two conditions apply no matter whether the tax is levied on sellers or on buyers. Now, let's use a graph to show what happens in the market after quantity tax. Without tax, the market equilibrium price and the quantity are P star X star. If the government taxes the sellers, the demand curve will not be affected, but the supply curve will move parallel upwards. The vertical moving distance is T, because for a certain quantity supplied, if the sellers are willing to accept the price P1 in the absence of tax, then they must require P1 plus T after taxation and the same quantity. Therefore, the new equilibrium after the tax is determined by the original demand curve and the upward shifted supply curve. The equilibrium quantity is XT, and the equilibrium price is PD. PD is the market price, which is actually paid by buyers. But the sellers can actually only receive PS after they pay the tax to the government. The difference between the paid by buyers and the received by sellers is T. Now we compare the original equilibrium and the new equilibrium. The tax reduces the quantity traded in the market, increases the demand price, and decreases the supply price. Consider the other case, when tax is levied on the buyers. In this case, the supply curve will not be affected, and the demand curve will move downward in parallel. The vertical distance of the two demand curves is also the tax rate, T. The demand curve shows the buyer's willingness to pay for the commodity. So after taxation, the buyer's willingness to pay for any amount of the commodity must decrease by T, because the actual payment of the buyers is price plus T. The new equilibrium after the tax is determined by the original supply curve and the downward shifted demand curve. The new equilibrium quantity is XT, and the price received by the seller is PS, but the buyers needs to pay PS and an additional T tax. Compare the equilibria before and after tax. As same as the tax on sellers, the tax on buyers reduces the quantity traded in the market, increases the demand price, and decreases the supply price. From the above analysis, we can see that if the tax rate is the same, the effect of taxing the buyer is the same as that of taxing the seller. With the tax, the buyers should pay more and the sellers should receive less. Both sides should bear the tax burden, no matter whom the tax is levied on. In other words, the tax could be shifted from one side to the other side. In the graph, before the taxation, the price paid by the buyer and received by the seller were both P star. After the taxation, the price paid by the buyer increased to PD, and the price received by the seller is reduced to PS. So for the tax T levied on each unit of goods, the buyers bear PD minus P star, and the sellers bear P star minus PS. The ratio of the two parts is called the tax incidence. The total tax paid by the buyer can be represented by the blue area. It's the tax paid by the consumer for each unit of goods multiplied by the quantity traded. Similarly, the total tax paid by the seller is represented by the red area. The sum of these two areas is the total revenue of a tax rate T. If the tax is levied on the seller shifts the blue part of the tax burden to the buyer. If the tax is levied on the buyer, they shift the red part to the seller. Why the tax can be shifted between the demand side and supply side? It can be explained by the market mechanism. For example, if a tax is levied on the seller and the original market price, the sellers actually receive less. So they would like to provide less products. Then the market has a shortage, which leads to an increase in the market price until the market gets equilibrium. By this way, the sellers pass on part of the tax burden to the buyers. Then, how much tax can the sellers pass on to the buyers? From the analysis of the process of the tax burden shifting, we can see it depends on how much the buyers and the seller can tolerate the change in price. That is, the price elasticities of demand and supply. For example, as the demand curve becomes steeper and the demand becomes more inelastic, consumers are becoming less sensitive to price changes. So they can bear more tax burden. The sellers can pass on more tax to the consumers. Especially if the demand curve becomes to a vertical line, the elasticity of demand is zero. The consumer bears all taxes, no matter whom the tax is levied on. In contrast, as the supply becomes more and more inelastic, the seller bears more and more tax burdens. When the supply is perfectly inelastic, the sellers pay all of the tax. We can derive the relationship between tax incidence and the elasticities in math. We know the tax increases the price paid by consumer from P star to PD, so the quantity demanded decreases by delta X. Around P star, the price elasticity of demand is equal to the percentage change in quantity demanded divided by percentage change in price. By rearranging this equation, we can find that the tax borne by the consumer is related to the price elasticity of demand. Similarly, we can write the price elasticity of supply. Its percentage change in quantity supplied divided by percentage change in price. And then, we rearrange this equation to find out the tax borne by the seller. Tax incidence is the ratio of tax paid by consumer to tax paid by seller. Substituting the above two equations into tax incidence, we get the conclusion. The tax incidence depends on the relative elasticities of demand and supply. Notice that the price elasticity of demand is negative. So a minus demand elasticity is a positive value. It shows the absolute value of elasticity. According to the result, we can see that if the supply is more elastic than the demand, the buyers should bear more tax burden. In the market, the elastic side could shift more tax burden to the inelastic side. And last, let's think about how the tax influences social welfare. Before tax, the total social welfare is the sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus. The total social welfare is in the green triangle. Similar to consumer surplus, we use the area below price and above supply curve to measure the producer surplus. It's the difference between the revenue received by the sellers and the cost for them. We'll discuss it further in producer's theory. After taxation, the price paid by consumers increases to PD. Therefore, the consumer surplus decreases, and the price received by the sellers decreases to PS. So, the producer surplus also decreases. Comparing the welfare before and after tax, the blank area is the decrease in the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. In this area, the yellow rectangle transfers to tax revenue, which received by the government, but the red triangle is gone. We call it deadweight loss caused by tax. Why does the tax cause a deadweight loss in total welfare? That's because the tax leads to a gap between the price paid by buyers and the price received by sellers. Then, some potential gains to trade cannot be realized. So the size of deadweight loss also depends on how the demand and the supply respond to the price change. That is, the price elasticities of demand and supply. Tax leads to a price change to the consumer and the seller. As the demand or the supply becomes less elastic, the demand or the supply responds less to the price change. So the deadweight loss will smaller, especially when the demand or the supply is perfectly inelastic. There's no deadweight loss. Therefore, generally speaking, tax will cause a deadweight loss and reduce social welfare. Only in a very special cases, where the elasticity of demand or the elasticity of supply is zero, the tax will not cause a deadweight loss. In this lecture, we learned about market equilibrium and examined the impact of taxation on market equilibrium. In next lecture, we will begin to learn another part, producer theory. See you next time.